The 2000 election was, up until recently, one of the most contentious ones in American history. Democratic candidate Al Gore won the popular vote, but due to the winner-take-all nature of the Electoral College, George Bush won all of Florida after contentious recounts and the Supreme Court getting involved. Bush's presidency would then be marked by the tragedy of 9/11, the disastrous War on Terror, and a general sense of malcontent that contributed to the election of President Obama in 2008. This election has been charged with every conspiracy under the book, but that's not what we're here to talk about. Instead, we're asking what if the election just went the other way, and Al Gore did win the 2000 election. Just a disclaimer, this video is a lot more political than I normally make. Obviously, the only way to access this video was to be a channel member, but I do still want to put it out there that this is specifically a perk of the exclamation point tier. So thank you guys for your continued support, and I hope you enjoy. Now, the easiest thing to do is just have Gore win Florida. Look, the margin was by like 500 votes. That's one more commercial in September. Or Nader not getting as many votes, but come on. Anyway, in this scenario, Florida is still highly contentious and is likely still forced to do a recount. However, much like in real life, as the recounts come in, it becomes clear that Gore has incredibly narrowly pulled off the win, and Bush makes the concession call. However, Gore immediately faces problems that Bush didn't, because we're only messing with about 500 votes in Florida's presidential race. The congressional elections are unchanged, which gives him a minority in the House and a tie in the Senate. This won't necessarily be debilitating for Gore. The Republican majority in the House is by like 9 seats, but he still needs to keep the Democrats as a very well-oiled machine for the first 2 years. Now, we'll get to the big stuff in due time, but first I want to talk about the domestic agenda of a Gore administration. The Democratic platform for that year was very happy to remind you that the Clinton administration had overseen the largest economic growth in the post-war US, and one of the only budget surpluses since. In contrast, the Republicans believed that such surplus was due to overtaxation of the public and wanted to cut them in the short term. Gore was also interested in new trade deals similar to NAFTA and continuing the free trade consensus that dominated American politics at the time. In addition, he wanted to attack hate crimes, bring about common sense gun laws, a continuation of the Clinton ban on assault rifles, as well as an expansion of Medicaid to combat insurance costs. Though, of course, this was phrased as part of a transition from welfare to work. Would all of this pass? Maybe. But again, Gore would be overseeing a minority for the first 2 years of his term. The last time that happened was in 1968 with Nixon, who mainly pushed the foreign policy questions of the day during his time, and inspiring anti-corruption laws. Now, Gore has a much slimmer minority than Nixon, but it is still a challenge that he needs to consider. Now, I will concede that party platforms, especially ones published after the conventions, are more for the base than the median voters. The people who vote in primaries and caucuses, who donate, etc. Thus, Gore will have to pick and choose what he prioritizes, especially before the midterms in 2002. Considering who Gore is, I think it's fair to assume that's mostly environmentalism and expanding internet access. The platform seriously calls for universal internet access, and while that's probably a tad hyperbolic for a few reasons, it does show us the domestic goals even outside continuing the economic growth. And yes, you can make the joke about Al Gore inventing the internet. But we all know that 2000 became a much more important election after the fact than it was ever supposed to be. With the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the next goal of American foreign policy went from containing the Soviet Union and the expansion of capitalism into Eastern Europe to getting revenge on the radical Islamic sects that had attacked the US. The goal of the attacks being to hurt American pride and punish the imperialism in the region, such as funding most of those groups that went on to mount the attacks. The question of whether or not the attack would happen in this scenario is a legitimate one, since it has been said that the inability to start a transfer team impacted the preparedness of the incoming administration. However, I do think that it would still happen in some capacity. The US just can't know everything, especially in this time period with a much weaker culture of surveillance and the internet's algorithms and data sale models still being in their infancy. So yeah, in this scenario, we're still going to have the attacks go ahead like they did in our timeline. The US would still go to war in Afghanistan. The Taliban was harboring the organization that claimed responsibility for the attack after all. However, what we wouldn't do is invade Iraq or push the Patriot Act, both of which were opposed by Al Gore in Congress, and the second war only serving to distract from the occupation and reconstruction of Afghanistan. However, the early stages of the war, the rapid destruction of the Taliban government and Al-Qaeda, as well as bin Laden's early escape into Pakistan, were before the invasion of Iraq, and while bin Laden certainly got lucky to escape a single day before NATO-aligned troops would have captured him, the US is likely still operating on the same timetable as in our timeline, meaning he still pulls off the same trick. The difference is, without Iraq, the US doesn't have to split its attention, meaning that it will be able to maintain the manhunt for bin Laden a lot more effectively and will likely have better results in wiping out the remnants of the Taliban. I won't pretend that this will make Afghanistan a bustling liberal democracy or anything. The nation building and attempts to force democracy down their throat were probably always doomed due to the same problems it encountered in real life. Controlling the cities of Afghanistan doesn't usually mean you control Afghanistan. The ethnic questions at the base of the country's politics, for once not Britain's fault, and the fact that the US just wasn't there to fix Afghanistan, it was there to get one guy. As a result, without Iraq, I think it's fair to have Gore pull off the manhunt and death of bin Laden around the summer of 2004. We'll talk about what this means for both Afghanistan and Iraq in a bit, but for now, let's stick to the US. Oh, and yeah, Gore wins 2004. There's just no way he doesn't. Whoever wins 2000 gets a rally to the flag effect like FDR in 1940, or the Republicans in 1868. Voting for the other guy just leaves most centrist voters with a bad taste in their mouth due to how much the president is tied into the nationalist propaganda going around. And in this timeline, Gore even managed to get bin Laden, giving him one last rallying cry that would crush whoever the Republican is. McCain feels like the logical choice for that sacrificial lamb, since his war hero status and ability to get things done on both sides of the aisle would likely be the biggest selling point. Or maybe they go for a more populist member of the party, either in a genuine dark horse move, or so the establishment can try to discredit them and expunge them from the party before it gets extreme, which has been done a few times. Of course, under a primary system, it's a bit more complicated than that, but regardless. Sorry to interrupt, but I do just want to thank you guys for your support on this video. This one isn't going to go public and is going to be exclusive to channel members forever as a thank you for the support. Now let's get right back to the show. Now, that budget surplus the Democrats were so proud of in 2000 would not survive 2001 to 2004. Mobilizing the most powerful war machine since the Vietnam War does tend to be expensive. I don't even really blame Bush for the deficit in the early years. Now, I will admit, the deregulation of the banks were likely in service to their 2000 platform, which focused on expanding home ownership through that same deregulation and loosening of zoning laws. But I think we can all agree that it was a little unsustainable and managed to make real estate, literally the most permanent thing on the planet, into an unreliable investment. Ergo, there likely isn't a major housing bubble in the lead up to 2008. Is there likely still a recession in some variety? Sure, you can't have the largest economic growth forever, that's just not how growth works in a capitalist system, but it likely isn't the biggest financial drain since 1929. Gore likely continues on his previous economic path and keeps the banks on a shorter leash than Bush, but the 2004 term will still be dealing with more foreign events than major economic reforms. Maybe Medicaid gets expanded, but who knows. The post-Bin Laden US likely has a bit of a return to normalcy vibe. While it still puts down troublemakers and rogue agents from time to time, the war on terror wouldn't become an all-encompassing political blob that takes over everything from foreign policy to privacy to allied trade relationships. The politics of the US in 2004 likely look a lot more like the politics of the US in 1999 to 2000. There was a bad guy there too, Milosevic, but the US went in, did its job, and stopped him. Granted, it's a lot more personal, but the idea is the same. The bastard's dead and the problem is behind us, why drag it out more than necessary? In addition, Gore is a very big believer in climate activism. In fact, most of his work since the 2000 election has tied back to the climate in some way or another. He's actually spoken in both chambers of Congress since this election, and has generally just remained committed to the goal. That being said, while he heads the Climate Reality Project, which puts a lot of emphasis on international relations and training Americans on how to reduce their emissions at home and on the international scene, it did take a bit of digging around to find any specific policies other than broader international agreements. Thankfully, I found an NPR article summarizing a 2007 speech he gave, which is likely not too far off from where he was on the issue in 2000. In it, Gore calls for a ban on incandescent light bulbs, a freeze on carbon dioxide to get carbon emissions down 90% by 2050, and enforce new regulations to improve gas mileage on cars. Now, he would likely struggle to get all of these through, and even if he did, the current size arms race American cars are going through is to cheat regulations, but it still gives us a guideline of what he'd aim for. So by now, I think the US emissions would likely be reduced comparatively, and there would likely be tighter international standards that a Democratic Congress would try to meet. There is also the matter of schooling. Both parties wanted to make serious education reform at this point. With Bush's win, this somewhat infamously resulted in No Child Left Behind, bringing about a greater degree of state control over education, but also a federal demand on standardized tests, wherein the schools that failed to meet certain standards would just have that funding diverted, creating a lose-more feedback loop. The Democratic plan, however, called for less emphasis on testing, but at the same time, schools that failed to meet whatever standards were in place would see administrative and educational restructuring. The platform directly called for schools that repeatedly failed to be shut down and have their staff replaced before they could reopen. I'll admit, I'm not against that in theory, but it would objectively be a major hike in federal power and would face logistical challenges in more rural communities without great access to schooling facilities. Granted, the Democratic base the platform was for wasn't exactly in those communities, but it's still worth pointing out. So I guess there would likely have to be an increase in schools built as well, which is always good, but if you can't get teachers, it's a waste anyway. Basically, education is messy. I'm not really qualified to comment on what would work and what wouldn't. I just see some patterns here. Come 2008, things get tricky. Because since World War II, neither major party in the US has held power for more than 4 consecutive terms. I think FDR kind of fucked with our heads on that a little bit, honestly. As a result, there will likely be some Democrat fatigue, no matter the successes in Afghanistan or regarding the economy. And to be fair, I do think there would be a recession, it just wouldn't be a great recession. We've had moderate recessions that have flipped elections before, so it's not like it's a shock to anyone the Republicans would have the advantage in 2008. The problem is, who the fuck do they run? Even if it would obviously be a poison nomination in 2004, the party leadership would still be taking notes from the probably inevitable defeat, and that would affect the '08 primaries. Given that I assumed the 2004 candidate would either be John McCain or a hypothetical radical, or them on the same ticket, I think they'd be out of the running for most of the moderates in the base in 2008. So, who was the runner-up in 2008? That seems like a good precedent. Mitt Romney. Romney is a weird candidate for this scenario. Firstly, his defeat in the '08 primaries was caused, in part, by a liberal history and being perceived as flip-floppy by the base. In addition, he had to deal with some bias from the more evangelical wing of the party, especially Huckabee's base. By 2008, he was generally in line with the party economically. He obviously opposed the ACA/Obamacare, believed in deregulation to get things going again, and generally wanted to maintain the free trade that both parties still liked at the time. However, he was also a bit of a hawk in terms of foreign policy. He dropped out of the 2008 primary in real life specifically because he felt weakening the Republican Party in a time of war was a mistake, and called Russia the US's greatest geopolitical rival, which got him a sneer and a clapback from Obama. Now, I'm not saying I agree with him on everything, but I feel like he's been vindicated on that particular branch of foreign policy. Of course, Romney's chances are only as good as the Democrats are bad, so who are they looking for in terms of a candidate? Well, they're in a near complete reversal of the real-life '08 primaries. They've been the incumbent for what would now be 16 years, have a successful war in a middling to sluggish economy. In contrast, in '08, the Republicans have been given 8 years and we're looking at the worst economy in 6 decades and 2 wars. As a result, the Democrats were able to run on promising big change and reform with a new young buck senator, and really double down on having a first candidate since the primaries were Obama versus Clinton. Now, I'm not sure either of them would be able to pull off the nomination. I think the party would want to maintain the Clinton-Gore style of politics, which might lead to Hillary winning the convention. Also, when I checked the 2008 Democratic primary, I found this. Obama fucking pulled the Electoral College on her ass. Except no, because I literally threw this map into 270 to win, and if it played out by straight Electoral College rules, she would have crushed him. Like, I get it. Delegates are different and superdelegates are literal cheat codes, but Jesus fuck. So, we have a Mormon liberal Republican who the base is, at best, apathetic to, versus one of the most controversial women in America who is running for a party that, while successful in foreign policy, is the face of the economic slump and major party fatigue. I think Romney wins this one, which is just kind of wild. It's also worth considering that without the war in Iraq, the anti-war movement is a lot weaker. After all, there's no moral ambiguity or big lie about WMDs, and the country is still high on its rally to the flag effect. Trusting government remains higher than it's been in our timeline, and generally speaking, people are less extreme in their push for change. While groups like the Tea Party or Bernie still gather some support, the establishment likely isn't going to be as discredited by the war or the economy. The economic aspects about change will also be mitigated for a while due to the lack of a Great Recession. Basically, up until 2012 at least, the politics of this world would feel like an extension of the late 90s, blending into a long 20th century model compared to our timeline. Before we get into President Romney's term, though, we should probably look at the Middle East in this world. With no Iraq war, what will become ISIS never really gets off the ground. Starting as a wing of Al-Qaeda, it exploded in power and numbers with the collapse of Saddam's regime in the country. Almost like dear old dad had a reason not to depose him, Georgie? Regardless, Iraq likely continues under that regime. While criticized as bellicose and authoritarian and regarded as a nuisance for the US, the Americans probably don't bother putting boots on the ground to get rid of him, and plans for a coup d'etat against his government were shelved after the attacks. As a result, he likely continues his dictatorship until he dies, which, given that he was 69 years old in 2003, would likely be before the 2008 election. I won't pretend to know if he's succeeded by a general or one of his children, both of which have been considered possibilities before, but I doubt it would transition to a democracy. After the Gulf War, rebellions by anti-Hussein Sunnis, Shiites, and Kurds were pretty common all over the country, but by 2003 had begun to stabilize. Now, Afghanistan is messier. The US likely withdraws from the area ahead of the 2004 election or just after it. Without Iraq, America was able to remain committed to crushing the Taliban and finding bin Laden, succeeding both in the summer of 2004. A date pulled squarely out of my ass, but regardless. But, as I said, I don't think the US would be able to prop up a bustling liberal democracy, even with that shorter, less American-dominated occupation. The Northern Alliance at the time was a Pashtun-dominated project, and while the remnants of the Taliban would have been crushed, that doesn't mean that everything is peachy keen. Now, to his credit, when the Islamic Republic elected their first president, Hamid Karzai, he knew that and sought to build bridges. However, his control over the country as a whole was limited, so this was difficult. In this timeline with the more thorough destruction of the Taliban forces, the opposition to his republic would be divided and unable to coordinate, and he was committed to his constitution, so democracy in Afghanistan could certainly hold out better than I initially gave it credit for. I won't really touch on the domestic politics of Afghanistan here, since the establishment of the republic is so different, and Karzai has to balance communists, liberals, monarchists, and all sorts of ethnic minorities. Hell, he wanted to reintegrate the Taliban into civilian society, at least come 2009. I think it's fair to say that his ideology was Afghanistan should exist, which is fair, but also makes finding political trends weird. What I will say is the Islamic Republic would be very pro-America, what with the whole facilitating their takeover and helping rebuild the country thing. Thus, with an allied government in Kabul that actively controls most of the country, and it not becoming the longest war in US history, it does seem likely we'd heavily invest in the area. I doubt it would become a first world nation or anything, but it would be doing infinitely better here. Of course, this also means that we have to consider what Pakistan is up to more readily, and likely makes the Americans even more wary of Russian expansion. Why does us being more wary of Russia sound familiar? Oh right, Romney. Now, in case it's not glaringly obvious, I'm left of center. I'm not a fan of Republican policy as a rule, but I can admit that tax cuts and deregulation are often good for short-term growth. So as long as Romney doesn't overdo it, he's probably fine for most of his term. And he likely can't overdo it, since 2014 is the first time the Republicans have passed a budget without Democrat support. And those Clinton-Gore Democrats that were oh so proud of that budget surplus and limited war in Afghanistan would likely prevent him from doing so unless he got an insane majority. Thus, the economy picks up after its slump and is generally back on track for 2012. Things are still good in America. The Middle East is at peace, Afghanistan is learning how to be a democracy, and the economy is on the uptick. He probably coasts to an easy 2012 re-election. And then Russia invades Crimea in 2014. Now, I've said before that this war is one of my limits on what I'll talk about, and I stand by that. But Romney was clear that he believed Russia to be a threat to American hegemony, whereas Obama brushed it off. Thus, I think it's fair to say that Mitt takes a much harder line against Russian aggression in Ukraine than we did historically, and he would have been right to make that call. With that, I do think I'm going to end this scenario here. Anymore, and not only are we getting into completely unknown waters due to the lack of a Great Recession and the resounding successes in Afghanistan, but we also just don't know who would come up in the 2016 primaries without the populist rhetoric that Obama sparked and failed to deliver on, which likely prevents the rise of Trump. And frankly, I doubt the Republicans go from Mitt Romney to Ted Cruz. In addition, with Romney cranking up the pressure on Russia after the invasion of Crimea, Europe will also be heavily impacted by all of this. I could easily see some disputes with certain countries who rely on Russia for natural gas arising. Not pointing any fingers. Again, thank you guys for the support of the channel, and join me next time as we explore another alternate world.